Welcome to the Supply Chain Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Sherry Heinisch, also called the Supply Chain Queen, joined with co-host James George. Today, we're exploring big idea number 7, supply chains as forest regeneration catalyst, a transformative concept that could redefine how supply chains interact with natural systems. Hi, Sophie.
Hi, how are you?
Good. It's so good to see you.
Sophie, lovely to meet you. I don't think we've met before. I was reading up on your profile beforehand. I'm really interested to get into this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
I think we've had a few conversations, Sherry, where we've started to go beyond talking about regeneration into actually thinking about what those nature-based solutions are. But I think we're going to get more into that today.
Well, get ready because Sophie is an expert. I know. I met her in New York and we chatted afterwards and I was like, I have to have you on this series.
I was honored to be asked.
One of the things that I remember, Sophie, from our meeting during New York Climate Week is that you're the Chief Sustainability Officer of International Paper. You have a very comprehensive background in forestry from Yale and partnerships with like Nature Conservancy, WWF, and you wear many hats.
Yes.
When you say CSO, it could mean literally like 5 jobs in one.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love that we're starting this episode with talking about impact because this is the holiday season we're entering and well-being, mental health, all of those things, setting New Year resolutions. I don't know if anyone started, but that was something that stuck with me when I met with you.
Yeah,
a couple
I agree.
months ago.
100%. Also, I did not get the memo on the black turtleneck, but I do have a black shirt. So I almost wore a black turtleneck. I think we would have had to explain ourselves if we all showed up unintentionally like that. So
Tis the season.
Sherry said your other podcasts, you're just like so bright and beautiful. I was like, I'm going to just wear black because that's kind of where I'm more comfortable.
I normally wear a black turtleneck also, but James and I are always twinning. So I went for eggplant.
Okay. I love it. That's great.
Brilliant. I wanted to start our conversation, I guess, maybe a little bit from a viewpoint from this side of the Atlantic and start with the EUDR. And I don't want to launch straight in with an acronym, so the European Deforestation Regulation. But it's been a funny journey from it's happening, it's delayed 12 months, it's not happening, it's being watered down, it's back on the table, and now we find ourselves in this really odd kind of place where no one really knows where we're going to end up and when it's going to come into force. But I guess that creates a real problem for businesses to plan and follow this agenda. And I think when I think about the relationship with forestry, and we've sort of gone through this iteration of better forestry practices to sustainable forestry to now thinking about regenerative forestry. Can you talk a little bit about how you kind of tackle that in your current role and in the roles previously?
Sure. Absolutely. It's complex. And I think, lots of thoughts, and I'll kind of start with what are we trying to achieve? So I think what EUDR has brought into focus is the necessity to ensure that forest products are legally sourced and are being traded in a way that is legal and ethical. That's sort of fundamental to doing business. So I work for a 126-year-old company. We've got to be able to operate legally and ethically, but we also want to be the best at thinking about how we're using the resources that our entire business model depends upon. And that's really forest and fiber from forest landowners. So I think what we have done and the way that we've thought about EUDR from first inception of this kind of as a concept was to say, what are the no regrets actions? Like, what would we do anyway? What's kind of good business practice? What builds trust with our suppliers, the landowners who manage the land, who impact the land and its future? What builds trust with our customers? And how do we ensure that we're putting solutions in place that are durable? Because I think fundamentally, at the beginning of the development of these kinds of regulations, there's some places in which they're going to have a really positive impact on the ground. And I would say probably more likely in some tropical countries, they're not going to have as much of an impact in places with really good forest governance and existing sustainable forest management approaches. And so what that means for those of us operating in some of those those geographies, US, North America, Europe, is that we need to think about how we implement a solution that makes sense for us, for who we are as a company, and for our key stakeholders. And so I think we've really been looking at this from the perspective of, everybody likes to know where the product they're buying comes from. And even if you're more excited about what's in the box than the box itself, when it lands on your doorstep, packaging is a critical, kind of global conveyor belt to trading in goods and getting things into the hands of consumers. And so I think we have to think about how we treat the materials that go into that box in a way that we feel is not just ethical and legal, but is actually best practice. And what I would say is that the part of that is we've been most sensitive to is not the technical solution, which frankly, we've had a system in place for traceability for a while that we could build on to be in compliance with EUDR. So we're ready to go. I think what we've been most sensitive to is the landowners, the small and medium-sized landowners that we require information from in order to make this work. And so, true to the expectation, it's not just about what a big company like IP does, it's about the expectation that we kind of hand down our supply chain. So those are the ways that we're thinking about it. And I think that the uncertainty around what happens with EUDR and the timing has just become kind of background noise. We have a solution, we're going to implement the solution, we're going to move forward, and hopefully we'll do that in a way that we don't lose the trust of our supplier.
Sorry, Shay, can I tease on that just a little bit? Because
go ahead. My dog's barking in the background, going crazy. I have no idea what's happening.
That last point you raised, Sophie, I guess, is part of the big challenge where I find ourselves in 2025 when we think about transparency and reporting, is that we are entirely beholden to our supply chain. And when we think about landowners, both in a forestry sense, but also in an agricultural sense, these individuals don't necessarily have the same level of time and sophistication. That's a bit of a simplification, but to serve us with the data that we need in order to remain compliant. How are you using technology to kind of bridge that gap so that folks growing trees, folks growing crops can continue to focus on what's core, but still service the need of a client like IP?
Yeah, I think the technological solutions are critical for a company of our size. And so we're managing those in different ways in different places. In the US, we have a geographic information system kind of web that we've built to help identify where is our fiber coming from and work with landowners so that we basically provide a technical resource to them to be able to get information from them about their forest land, which includes biodiversity and water, forest connectivity, and a lot of other data. And we do the technical work to put that into a sort of a GIS-based system that then allows us to communicate and report with transparency to our key stakeholders. I think that part of why that's becoming so important, and as we get sort of more sophisticated systems for spatial and monitoring in general, is that it allows us to identify interventions that can be as early as possible to create positive outcomes on the ground. And we talk a lot about that internally. International Paper was the largest private forest land owner in the US until the early 2000s. And then we sold or divested of most of that forest land. And so now we just buy fiber from suppliers. Well, those relationships we depend on, we have to ensure that not only are we acting in the right way, but we're sensitive to the needs of those landowners and we're engaging them in a process that is essentially about how that box that we produce goes all the way back to the forest land. So I think that the technology as it develops gives us more opportunities to make those early interventions. And really where we are right now in this kind of forest, biodiversity, water, and carbon space is how do we get good data into these systems? And how do we not wait for the perfect data to start to act?
It's a great insight. And also, I'm just thinking the challenges tied to your commercial proposition you're offering. You have a living infrastructure that you're proactively maintaining and nurturing. You're tied to the communities where you operate and where you supply raw materials. But it's not just about sourcing, it's about nurturing a living infrastructure that is
Absolutely.
critically tied to you.
Yeah.
Which is a different mindset. And so when you think about, we mentioned data, the importance of data, exponential tech, space tech, are there other emerging trends or leading practices when we think about regenerating that living ecosystem nature as a key stakeholder, biodiversity as a key outcome?
I think what I'm seeing right now in terms of trends is that people are talking about nature more. I'm a forester by education. So nature's always been kind of obvious to me, but I'm like, oh, nature's having a moment. This is exciting. Like people around the world are starting to think about nature. Fundamentally, I think that we have, as a company, always had to think about it. But right now, we're having to appreciate and sort of, I would say, articulate what the actual connectivities are between sourcing fiber into our systems, making boxes, and actually things like biodiversity and carbon and water. And the beauty of this is that our mills are the size of football pitches, football fields. You can't move them. So if your sourcing region is like 100 miles around the mill, you're not going to be able to deplete that resource and just pick up and move the mill. You really have to be thinking about the sustainability of the system. And what we know is that it's not just about the wood fiber, it's about the entire ecosystem and the really complex interdependencies between some of the species who live there and the water quality and quantity and the ability of those forests to continue to retain and to capture carbon. So the beauty of forests as a system is that as long as the sun shines and the rain falls, like the trees generally grow. But if you're not thoughtful about long-term outcomes, you can degrade and damage that ecosystem beyond repair. And that's where I think our sector has to think a little bit differently than a quarterly or even an annual cycle. We have to think about the long-term future of those forests. I really love engaging forest landowners on things that they may not really be thinking about. It's rare that you find a forest landowner who doesn't want to know there's some incredible charismatic bird species on their property. And once they know that, they think a little bit more about the system and the interconnectedness. And landowners are so wise and knowledgeable about what's on their land, but sometimes they don't know, well, actually, this bird species prefers this kind of habitat. So if we modify the way you're thinking of doing that harvest, we can promote you seeing and hearing more of that, incredibly beautiful species. So I think that part of this is just human nature. How are we connecting what we see and appreciate and enjoy and need with the nurturing of the environment upon which we depend?
I love that, Sophie. And not to get super duper nerdy, although I feel very comfortable doing that with you.
Good company.
Have you seen the latest research about the relationship with bird songs and forest health?
I've seen some of this. If we're talking about like bioacoustic monitoring, I really get very nerdy on that. Yes.
And how like specific species of birds and the song or music that they create, it is literally interacting with that specific natural system in ways that promote all the things that we would expect. I haven't met many people who have a PhD in forestry, but you understand like all of the interconnectedness and dependencies and nuances. And so it must be really fascinating for you when you think about commercial operations and the business side of value chain interacting with the forest instead of just putting the forest at the center of the enterprise. It's a weird paradigm shift that I think that's what we're after when we talk about becoming more regenerative. Nature is the stakeholder that's at the center. The forest is the catalyst. It's not the other way around.
Yeah, that's right. And I heard something recently that just resonated so much with me. So I can't take credit for this, but I'm using it a lot now. Nature is the silent guarantor of all other capital. So let that soak, right? I mean, it's so true, right? I mean, so when we talk about the spectrum of the way corporates operate, from sort of risk management to investing in regenerative approaches, there's a whole spectrum of ways in which we're acknowledging the importance of that capital without directly valuing it in most cases, directly valuing all of the goods and services from a forest. And so I sort of see that part of the joy that I get from my job is working with our fiber supply organization in particular, and then working with a lot of our sales folks to try and translate that. How do we make that box, which comes from a high emotion resource, but is sort of a low emotion product, how do we help it carry through the story and the narrative of forests as underpinning that product?
I mean, it's fascinating to hear you describe it in that way, Sophie, and I completely agree. I guess my question that comes is, there is somewhere along that journey where, whether you're looking at this as sustainability, a circular, a climate, a regenerative lens, there is a commercial component to it at the end. And how do you rationalize that? And I guess in your industry, it feels both more obvious and more difficult, because regenerative forestry tends to be longer rotation periods or short-term yields. And of course, your industry has very quick timelines, very low margins. To your point before about a huge mill, 100 kilometers, you can't move it. You've got to manage that for the long term. And I think that is sometimes the challenge in this space with other industries, when people try to look beyond the quarter return, beyond the month return, and look at that long-term stability of the supply chain. How have you cracked that at IP? Because I imagine it's kind of been easy.
Well, I wouldn't say that we have all the answers. I think about it a little bit like this. We should, and this is where the science can support us, we need to be fairly unsentimental about the goods and services and the values. I say that being entirely sentimental and emotional, but we should, from a financial perspective, we should lean into that sort of unsentimental valuation, because what I think we need to do is recognize the goods and services that are coming from forests and figure out how to manage them optimally for delivery on all of those things, for landowners, for communities, for consumers, etc. I would say over time, in the journey of sustainable forestry into a space that's more regenerative, we have done a much better job at looking at, it's not just about what happens at this point in time, but every tree I harvest now has an impact on how this forest looks in 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. And I think that there's some complexity in the goods that come out of forests, from everything from saw timber that you would use to build a house or furniture to kind of the pulpwood that we use to make boxes. What I see now is a highly efficient system in which maximum utilization creates no waste of resources. And I think that's key. That's the sort of unsentimental approach. And the work that happens around that is to ensure through best practices in forest management that where trees need to be replanted, they're replanted. Where we need to look more closely at waterways and buffers to maintain water quality, we're doing a better job at that. And where we think about species and habitat, we can work around management prescriptions for that forest to ensure that those things also survive and thrive. So I think it's been, in my journey in forestry, it's really gone more from what is utilitarian forestry into a space of recognizing the goods and services that forest provides and thinking about how we optimize forest and fiber use for all of those things. And I don't think it has to mean a compromise in the economic value to the landowner or the material that goes into things like boxes and houses. I do think it means reconsidering how you think about the forest system, and working with partners really helps with that. Working with the Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, those kinds of organizations bring in different perspectives that ask us to question all the time the approaches that we're taking.
Just a curiosity. I'm just interested to see if this is sort of showing up in that kind of strategy when you look at a long-term plan with your forest management. You hear quite a lot in some of the sort of sympathetic industries around coffee and cocoa and all that sort of things, that actually as the climate of the globe is changing, species are migrating to kind of cooler climes, or they're migrating up the mountain in the example of kind of coffee. And that provides a long-term challenge in terms of they can only migrate so far before there's no space for them to go, which is why predictions on the cost of these sort of materials are going to be so high in the future. Are you seeing that when you kind of plan your forests at the moment? Are we seeing migratory movement of species that mean that what was true 50 years ago might not be true in 50 years' time?
I think it's a really important question. I would say that some forest land owners and forest managers who are closer to the resource and kind of in control of that and have the ability to look long term are thinking very much about that. Caribou in the boreal is a great example. Companies or owners who have large land holdings, and you need scale to see this, because otherwise you're dependent upon sort of looking south of you to figure out if what somebody has on their land is moving to where you are. But I think that, fundamentally, I think forest managers who are looking at those long-term timescales are anticipating and predicting where pests or disease or wildlife or changes to water quantity are starting to impact their operations. The way that shows up more for us, and I think that most folks would say this even in the agricultural space, is like extreme weather events and how those are impacting supply. And that becomes a real challenge because those things, while at once we thought they were easy to predict, now we're seeing hurricanes and floods in regions that wouldn't have had those 1,000 years over the last 1,000 years. And so I think the predictability of that is really where we have to lean into some of the best available climate data, whether it's from insurers or asset managers, and think a little bit more, I would say, specifically and intentionally about what do we do differently as a company? Because as I said before, you can't pick up and move our assets. They're really stuck there. They're very large. So how are we thinking about adaptation and resilience going forward is the question that I'm often bringing in front of our leaders.
Well, I'm thinking atmospheric rivers. We often
Yes.
think about drought and, warmer climate, but we learned about atmospheric rivers in a previous 10 Big Ideas episode, specifically in California. And I happened to be in California and experiencing like extreme flooding, and you just see massive trees, roots as big, far larger than me, just like in the middle of the road. And it's because of the flooding and the erratic weather on the other side of the spectrum.
I can really relate to that being in the Pacific Northwest. When we have one of those, you better hunker down and get your rain jackets lined up on the hooks because they're never going to dry out.
Yeah, exactly. Sophie, I did have a question. You mentioned something about a box, which it was actually very inspirational the way that you framed it, that this is something that is very ordinary, and how can you take it and create some sort of like human emotion or experience around the care and the stewardship of this box. The reason I mention it is because being a supply chain geek, we are headed into the holiday season, and this is, for many people, the season of deliveries, e-commerce, many, many, many boxes, and many, many, many returns, often up to 55% of commerce and goods purchased during the next 60 days are returned by the end of January. How can we, in a very creative way, consider some of the education around what you're describing, being more regenerative, being a steward of the fiber and all the value chain, all of the hands that were stacked to give a customer that seemingly small box that could mean absolutely nothing to them and end up in their trash can?
I mean, I think that the question we all have to ask is kind of what you're getting at, which is what can the average consumer do? How do we think about this and what can we do about it? One of the things that we really pride ourselves on in our entire sector is the naturally circular cycle of our box making. And I think the way that the consumer can contribute to that is to recycle the box. And that's easier than ever in most municipalities where there's a local collection, or you can take your corrugated material to a collection facility. And basically what that does is, our boxes in the US are about 35% recycled content. In Europe, it's much higher. It's in the high 90s. It's a very recycled content system. So the more times we can put those boxes back into the system, the more circular this economy becomes. I think the other thing that we think a lot about is packaging that's fit for purpose. And so increasingly we're seeing trends in the sector, and this will show up during the holidays where we see more fiber-based mailers, or we see lighter weight packaging that's fiber-based. And I think the fiber-based component of that is critical because what that's doing is it's encouraging the kind of forestry that I just shared and talked about. It's encouraging landowners to keep those forests as forests because they have an economic incentive to do so. And I think working with responsible companies and really kind of looking into where do those materials come from and how is the company, is it an IP or another company? How are they thinking about the resources they use? That's sort of the elevated end consumer ask. And at the end of the day, in our industry, there's been a lot of focus on deforestation, which is totally anathema to our business model. I think that where there has been some pretty significant and long-lasting damage around deforestation, largely in, a lot of tropical areas, largely driven by agriculture and by bad actors. I mean, most of us who are working in this space are really dependent upon forest resources for the long term. So we're trying to shift the paradigm so that our customers and our consumers and our other stakeholders see the opportunity to actually even partner to have that on the ground impact, to really be thinking about nature in all its aspects. And, this time of year, as you mentioned, we're all getting a lot of boxes in our doorstep. So let's think about what we can do, whether it's recycling or reusing that material.
Yeah. James, take us home.
Lots to unpick in there. I'm curious how provocative I want to be here. I guess a lot of the things you explained there, and it's really interesting to hear the kind of difference between the recycled contents and the different geographies, and that's understandable. How do we only allow consumers to make good choices? Because as businesses who have the control on these supply chains, we only give them options that are the best possible options out there. So it's the highest possible recycled content, or the business model that allows a reuse or a take back component. All of these things that businesses in your industry, but also across all industries, are thinking about. But let's not get into that. So my question, I guess,
not the give back box. That was
not the give back box. No, or reposting the box. It's kind of like, let's think about the system and everything else. But I guess, the show just mentioned, we are going towards the end of the year and people start to look to kind of 2026 and beyond. So what is your big bet for next year? Not necessarily as the CSO of IP, but as someone who has a long-standing heritage in kind of forestry. When we think about, for your industry, the importance of managing those assets, but broader than that is actually our general relationship with nature in the supply chain. What's your big bets for 2026? What do you want to see more of?
It's a great question. I think you're getting into New Year's resolution territory. I think I would say that my mantra, no matter what the year is, how is what we're doing now going to have on the ground impact or to positively influence our supply chain out to our customers? And so my driving imperative is really, how do we deliver sustainable outcomes? And I think those sustainable outcomes can be, how do we partner with people who are landowners, managers, advisors, conservation organizations to make a difference on the ground? And how do we kind of take that through and translate that out to our customers and other stakeholders so that choosing a fiber-based packaging item for whatever their need is becomes their top choice? And I think that as long as it's fiber-based and we're looking at that renewable resource as one that we can sustainably manage, we can regeneratively think about the system, then I think that that's really positive. I would say that one sort of added hope and expectation, and we haven't talked much about this, but I'll mention it as a parting thought, is that forests have such an opportunity to contribute positively to climate mitigation and to climate change mitigation and to carbon. And, as I said, as long as the rain falls and the sun shines, trees are going to sequester carbon. And we are starting to see some absolutely fantastic examples about small family forest landowners who are managing sustainably and are creating additionality for carbon in their landscape. And that's where this sort of natural capital solution that forests bring is so brilliant. And it can deliver the multiple goods and services that we're talking about. And working with organizations who are really authentically trying to create credibility in the voluntary carbon market right now, I think we're going to see all types of breakthroughs in 26. And I think this is a place that everybody, not just in the forest product sector, wants to tune in, because if we give forests the chance, they can be so much more than just a source of fiber for a box. They can be so much more for nature. They can be so much more in terms of long-term value. And why wouldn't we lean into that?
I love it. Sophie for the trees. Sophie for the trees. Sophie, you are so brilliant. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us and the listeners. I know that it's gonna click, because this is the seventh big idea, and so they've had a lot of context moving into forest positive, regenerative supply chains, which you've explained on many levels and unpacked for us today. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you
really
both.
Appreciate it.
I loved it. Let's do it another time. But I really love the opportunity to talk about this. I'm passionate about it, and I'm going to continue to be in this space. So stay tuned.
Awesome.
Amazing.